So, another year, another June, and another Rainbow Logo Month. I know some people who appreciate corporate pride because they argue that despite everything, it's a net positive for the LGBT community that their presence is celebrated and normalized, however commercially that might happen. However, most people I know find corporate pride problematic, albeit for two very different reasons. On the one hand, it's of course considered counterproductive to have very real political issues being commodified by companies who are looking to sell more shit to our collective demise. And this is the type of critique I myself usually follow. But the other one is perhaps more interesting because it delves into a whole other box of issues. Because the other people who don't like that Starbucks or Nike cater to different marginalized groups of people and their political pursuits think they shouldn't do so because they think identity politics is inherently bad. Francis Fukuyama neatly sums up the sort of standard critique of identity politics in his book Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment. He thinks that focusing on identities within politics will lead to a more fragmented society that emphasizes victimhood and that ultimately has a negative impact on liberal democracies, because our institutions of liberal democracies are based on the principle of universal rights and equal citizenship, which can be undermined, in their view, by the particularism inherent in identity politics. This is also the sort of argument that characters like Jordan Peterson became famous for when he thought that misgendering being considered a hate crime under Canadian law was detrimental to freedom of speech and, in turn, to liberal society. Now, when people criticize identity politics, I get where I think the majority of people are coming from, just because a lot of the times identity politics, at least in the internet age, comes across as insanely annoying. Yet, as a fellow minority myself, I mostly think that criticizing identity politics from a liberal stance is silly, because all politics are identity politics, and it has always been that way. Even if you don't realize it, the group that you see yourself as being part of, whether that's the group of people you grew up around, your economic status, your religion, whatever else, probably influences your politics way more than anything else in your life will. And I still think that that reigns true for the neoliberal Fukuyama types as much as anyone else. So that's why I don't see identity politics as a threat to our democratic system. However, what I do think is actually the lack of identity politics, or the depoliticization of absolutely everything. The concept of anti-politics, also known as anti-party politics, anti-party populism, or techno-populism, has become increasingly prevalent in contemporary discourse. Today, it's common for individuals, corporations, and even nonprofits to declare themselves as apolitical. This trend is seen by many as virtuous because, given the evident flaws of our current political systems and the divisiveness and polarization that it often entails, distancing oneself from politics seems like an intelligent choice, or a way to assert one's complexity and refusal to be reduced to simple party affiliations. However, there's something fundamentally harmful about this tendency, because claiming to be apolitical does not, of course, free one from having ideologies, values, and thoughts about better ways to run things. The only thing it really does practically is creating a pretense of being apolitical makes it incredibly and unnecessarily difficult to engage in any meaningful discussions. It creates barriers to understanding and cooperation, hindering the very progress and problem solving that our complex societies so desperately need. At the same time, I have some sympathy for anti-politics supporters, because engaging in popular political discourse can be exhausting to say the least, especially in today's hyper-connected and information-saturated world. General fatigue, I think, seems inevitable if you just try to follow the news. So being a public commentator on politics seems even more exhausting than I think ever before. Yet, in reality, everything is political, including the apolitical stance itself. The philosophy at the core of an apolitical attitude is elusive, making it difficult to grasp. It aims to remain undefined, accessible only to those deemed intelligent enough to understand it, much like how medicine is gatekept through Latin and philosophy through complex language. Apoliticism creates an air then of superiority, which allows individuals to claim that they're neither fascist nor communists, not right-wing or left-wing, they're simply in the center, or completely apolitical. And that can be frustrating to watch, as it often feels like a cop-out from a meaningful discussion and that everyone just retreats to being fence-sitters. And this postmodern development in politics is also neatly summarized by Fukuyama in what is perhaps his most famous work, The End of History, where he argues that liberal democracy represents the endpoint of humanity's ideological evolution, which marks the end of history understood as a sequence of ideological struggles and disagreements. And this liberal and quite optimistic take was echoed in many other thought leaders throughout the 80s. Margaret Thatcher comes to mind, who famously declared that there was no such thing as a society, when encouraging people to be self-reliant rather than depending on the government to cope with whatever issues they were having. But of course, this isn't actually apoliticism. This is just its own ideology. It's not the end of an ideological evolution, but as what is quite clear in retrospect, it's the beginning of an anti-politics, liberal, market-reliant type of ideology, which I think is a lot worse than any previous ideologies precisely because it doesn't consider itself as one. By declaring it as something that is aside from ideology and rooting its logic in economic metrics, we're not supposed to see it as an ideology. We're supposed to interact with it as if it's cold, hard truth or something akin to scientific law. And that is at the core of what came next, which is the ideology of the market, which is most often considered even today as an apolitical and neutral force. A market-driven approach is supposedly the most efficient at resource allocation, and the market will always give people what they want at the right price, as well as fostering innovation through competition. Politics, on the other hand, is the antithesis and the arch-nemesis of the market, only slowing down and preventing further prosperity from happening. Market ideology in this way depoliticizes society by framing economic issues as technical problems that need to be solved, as opposed to political issues that require democratic debate and collective action. And this depoliticization strips away the democratic dimension of issues like healthcare, education, housing, and reduces them then to just mere commodities. As a result, citizens are redefined as consumers whose primary role is to choose between different products and services, rather than active participants in shaping their societies. But this way of speaking in market terms isn't only limited to the people who subscribe to a market ideology. It affects everyone living in a society because the market-oriented language shapes how we discuss societal and environmental issues, often at the expense of any ideological arguments. Because the trend that we see has created a scenario where the only arguments that are taken seriously are those that align with economic logic, efficiency, and market values. So ideological perspectives, no matter how valid or deeply held, are frequently dismissed as illogical, inefficient, or irrelevant in the face of market pragmatism. For example, when advocating for the protection of nature, we see this quite clearly. Even though in the 1970s there was a large movement that sought to argue for why nature has intrinsic value and should therefore and henceforth be protected as if it did have such value, those arguments were easily dismissed because their arguments did not conform to any economic logic. While it might be true and ethically compelling to argue that nature has intrinsic worth, this perspective often fails to carry any weight in a society that prioritizes economic gain over most other things. And as a result, advocates for environmental protection often resort to using market terms to make their case. In Australia, for instance, markets have been created to assign economic values to the lives of endangered species. This approach aims, of course, to fit environmental concerns into market frameworks as a hope to make it more palatable and actionable in a world that prioritizes economic metrics. However, this market-centric valuation of living entities is inherently problematic, because while framing environmental protection in market terms might provide short-term gain, and it's truly aligned with a contemporary economic discourse, it also fundamentally undermines the intrinsic values and ethical considerations that are essential to genuine conservation. Because true environmental stewardship requires recognizing and acting upon the inherent worth of nature beyond what can be captured by market valuations. Another way this market logic is skewed, I think we saw during the pandemic, when it became awkwardly clear which jobs in our societies are actually the most important for our collective survival and thriving. And those jobs were not the ones that the market has deemed most valuable. It wasn't investors and lawyers and CEOs and data scientists who were crucial for our survival during that time. It was truck drivers, nurses, grocery store employees that were so important that they had to keep working despite major health risks. Because these professions are the ones who contribute, of course, the most to collective welfare, despite most being historically undervalued in the market. And this is all to underscore that the ideology of the market is not equal to the ideology of human nature or welfare. These are two completely different things that sometimes value the same things, but most importantly, this environment that we've created, as I mentioned, makes ideological arguments stand out as a sore thumb. It makes terms like identity politics even possible to say or differentiate from politics, because again, all politics are obviously identity-based and have always been that way. A fundamental part of creating the best society for everyone to live in is to recognize the different identities in a society and working to create conditions that make it best for the people who are worse off without any governing. But at this point in history, identifying with any political movement is then seen as quite extreme, because depoliticization combined with market ideology dismisses all politics as identity politics. As Fukuyama so neatly put it,
as you say, Black Lives Matter is fighting for equality and basic rights. ISIL, extremist group, terrorist group, whatever you want to call it, has a very genocidal approach to the rest of the world, isn't fighting for equality and justice, clearly. But then you seem to lump them together in this critique of identity politics. You literally put them together on the same page.
Yeah. Well, morally, obviously, they're not equivalent at all. I think what's the same is actually the psychology.
Movements like BLM are bad in his mind because it's divisive and perpetuates victimhood and ruins democracy, even though all political movements have been accused of doing that throughout time. If you look just back at the civil rights movement, we forget that many people dismissed them in a similar way. They were seen as extremists who wanted special treatment and would go to any length, irrational length, to get it, right? We only see things the way we do now because our collective societal ideology has evolved and changed over time. And I also think that the ideology of the market has created a system that's ripe for propaganda, with a weakened connection to genuine political engagement and just a weakened presence of it in your everyday lives. People rarely identify with political movements anymore. Not even politicians do. So this detachment allows for the demonization of concepts like socialism in America. When the term socialism is conflated with communism, it's conflated with Marxism, and it's generally conflated with just meaning bad or shitty. Politicians like Bernie Sanders were vilified for their socialist views, which are considered extreme. Yet, in Norway, these views are seen as moderate and practical, if not quite conservative. But socialism, of course, is not inherently good or bad. It is simply a political stance that advocates for the means of production to be owned and regulated by the community as a whole, as opposed to any single individual. And of course, if you actually did study social economics, you'd find that we need a bit of many theories to best address different social issues most efficiently. And there's no need to vilify a term like socialism because it's simply just a term. But the Red Scare propaganda thing, I think, really has stuck in American discourse because of the insistence that we currently are in a depoliticized and non-ideological reality. And this shift towards a post-ideological ideology makes it incredibly inefficient to engage in real democratic discussion. Because before addressing any of the actual issues, we must first confront the identity that the market ideology that presents itself as neutral and unbiased has, like I've just literally done in this video. And this prerequisite not only makes the political discourse unnecessarily convoluted, but also highly inaccessible, which allows the market ideology to dominate unchallenged. The biggest problem here is that nobody has the balls to call themselves a fucking socialist, except for unemployed actual extremist teenagers on Reddit, when this used to be what every politician used to do. As Slavoj Žižek aptly put it, ideology is strong exactly because it is no longer experienced as ideology. We feel free because we lack the very language to articulate our unfreedom. In conclusion, then, the evolution of societal ideology and the dominance of market logic has created significant barriers to meaningful political discussion and discourse. Recognizing and addressing these barriers is crucial to foster a more informed and equitable and democratic society. By reconnecting with genuine political ideologies and challenging the dominance of market logic, I think we can create a more balanced and inclusive political landscape. And this means that the issue is not the existence of corporate pride itself, but rather that the most prevalent critique of corporate pride is not about its commodification, but simply a critique of identity politics. By shifting our focus to address the underlying commodification, I think we could better understand and address the true challenges within our political and social systems.